In the year 1324, a man left the city of Mali and began walking toward Mecca. This was not unusual. Thousands of Muslims made the Hajj every year, the sacred pilgrimage to the holy city that was one of the 5 pillars of the faith, an obligation that every Muslim who was physically and financially capable of undertaking it was expected to fulfill at least once in a lifetime. What was unusual, what was so far beyond the range of anything the world had previously witnessed that it would be talked about for centuries afterward and would leave economic consequences that lasted for more than a decade, was what this particular man brought with him. He brought 60,000 soldiers. He brought 12,000 personal servants, each one dressed in silk and carrying a golden staff. He brought 500 personal attendants for himself alone, each walking ahead of him and carrying a golden staff weighing about 2 kilograms. He brought 80 to 100 camels, each one loaded with 300 pounds of pure gold dust. He brought wives, concubines, scholars, poets, architects, and cooks. He brought the wealth of an empire so vast and so rich that the people who saw him pass through their cities genuinely did not know how to comprehend what they were looking at. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was the ruler of the Mali Empire, the most powerful state in West Africa and one of the largest and wealthiest empires in the world at the time of his pilgrimage. By most credible estimates, adjusting his wealth for inflation and for the relative value of gold in his era, Mansa Musa was the wealthiest human being who has ever lived. Not the wealthiest person of his time. Not the wealthiest African. The wealthiest person in the recorded history of the entire world. And almost nobody outside of West Africa had ever heard of him. This is his story. To understand who Mansa Musa was and what he represented, it is necessary to understand the world he came from, because the Mali Empire that he ruled and the West African civilization that produced him were not the peripheral, underdeveloped, marginal societies that later European colonial mythology would depict. They were, at the height of their power, among the most sophisticated, most prosperous, and most intellectually vibrant civilizations on Earth, and the story of how that reality came to be so completely obscured from the Western historical imagination is itself one of the most significant and most consequential acts of historical erasure in the history of the modern world. West Africa in the medieval period was shaped above all by geography, and specifically by the relationship between 2 geographical zones that could not have been more different from each other. To the north lay the Sahara Desert, the largest hot desert in the world, a vast and seemingly impassable barrier of sand and rock that stretches from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania to the Red Sea coast of Sudan, covering an area larger than the continental United States. To the south lay the Sahel, the semi-arid transitional zone between the desert and the more fertile savanna grasslands below it, and then the savanna itself, a landscape of grasslands, scattered trees, and seasonal rivers that was home to some of the most productive agricultural land in Africa. Further south still lay the tropical rainforests of the Guinea coast, impenetrable to large-scale organized trade but rich in resources including gold. The key to understanding West African civilization in the medieval period is the trans-Saharan trade route, because the Sahara that appeared from the outside to be an impenetrable barrier was in fact a road, one of the most important trade highways in the medieval world, connecting the cities of North Africa and the Mediterranean to the agricultural and mineral wealth of sub-Saharan Africa, through a network of oases that allowed camel caravans to cross thousands of miles of desert. The goods that moved along these routes were the foundations of enormous wealth. Gold and salt were the primary commodities, and the relationship between them shaped the entire political economy of medieval West Africa. The savanna regions south of the Sahel contain some of the richest gold deposits in the world, particularly in the regions known to medieval geographers as Bambuk and Bouré, located in what is now western Mali and eastern Senegal. Salt, which was essential for food preservation and was found in large quantities in the salt mines of the Sahara at places like Tagaza, was scarce in the sub-Saharan regions and commanded extraordinary prices there. The trade in gold moving north and salt moving south created a commercial network of enormous value, and the states that controlled the key points on these trade routes, the crossings, the markets, the checkpoints, accumulated wealth on a scale that the agricultural societies of Europe, which had no equivalent commercial infrastructure at this period, could barely imagine. The Ghana Empire, which occupied the territory of what is now southern Mauritania and western Mali from roughly the 6th to the 13th centuries, was the first of the great West African trading states to emerge and to be documented in the written sources that have survived. Despite sharing its name with the modern country of Ghana, the Ghana Empire was located several hundred kilometers to the northwest of the modern state, in the Saharan border zone where the trade routes converged and where the control of commerce translated directly into political power. The Arab geographer al-Bakri, writing in the 11th century, described Ghana's capital as one of the greatest cities he had ever heard of, with a royal palace of extraordinary grandeur and a king whose court received ambassadors from across the Islamic world. The king of Ghana sat surrounded by his court in a manner that al-Bakri found simultaneously alien and impressive, with golden accessories, elaborate ceremonial protocol, and a standard of material splendor that testified to the enormous wealth that control of the trans-Saharan trade generated. The Ghana Empire eventually declined under pressure from the Almoravid movement from North Africa and from internal political fragmentation, and it was succeeded in the 12th and 13th centuries by a series of smaller states that competed for control of the trade routes and the mining regions. From this competition emerged the Mali Empire, built by the Keita dynasty of the Mandinka people whose ancestral homeland lay in the savanna region of what is now Guinea and western Mali. The founding figure of the Mali Empire, or at least the figure around whom its founding mythology is organized, was Sundiata Keita, a ruler whose life was so dramatic that it became the subject of a great oral epic, the Sundiata, that is still recited by the griots, the hereditary storytellers and oral historians of West African civilization, to this day. Sundiata's story, as the oral tradition tells it, is one of the great narratives of medieval Africa. He was born into the royal family of the Keita clan but was a physically disabled child who could not walk, and in the political world of medieval West Africa, where a ruler's physical capacity was directly tied to his authority as a military leader, his disability appeared to doom him to irrelevance. His mother, Sagalin, was persecuted by the co-wives in his father's court who saw in her son's weakness an opportunity to advance their own children's claims to succession. Sundiata grew up in humiliation and eventually in exile, driven from his homeland with his mother and reduced to wandering through neighboring kingdoms as a stateless refugee. Then, according to the oral tradition, he grew into a man of extraordinary physical and spiritual power, overcame his disability through a combination of determined effort and supernatural intervention, and returned to his homeland to fight for his inheritance against the tyrant Semanguru Kanti of the Sasso people who had conquered the Mandinka lands. He defeated Semanguru at the Battle of Karina around 1235 and established the Mali Empire, beginning the dynasty that would eventually produce Mansa Musa. Whether Sundiata was a historical figure, a mythological construct, or some combination of both, is a question that oral history and archaeology together have not definitively resolved. What is clear is that by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Mali Empire was a genuinely powerful and extensively organized state covering a territory that stretched from the Atlantic coast in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east, from the Saharan salt mines in the north to the gold-producing regions of the south, encompassing an area that modern historians estimate at roughly 2 million square kilometers, making it one of the largest empires in the world at that time. The empire was organized around a sophisticated system of governance that combined centralized royal authority with a degree of local autonomy that made the administration of such a vast territory practically possible. The Mansa, the king or emperor, sat at the apex of a hierarchical system that included provincial governors appointed by the central court, local chiefs who maintained traditional authority within their own communities but acknowledged the sovereignty of the Mansa, and a professional military force that could project royal power across the empire when necessary. The empire's economy was based fundamentally on the control of trade rather than on direct agricultural production, and this meant that the court's primary concern was with the maintenance of the commercial infrastructure, the roads, the markets, the security of the caravans, and the system of taxes and duties that extracted a portion of the enormous wealth moving through the empire's territory. Gold was at the heart of everything. The Mali Empire sat astride the richest gold-producing regions in the world as they were known to medieval people, and the control of these regions gave the Mansa a leverage over the international economy of the medieval world that no other single ruler could match. The Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited the Mali Empire several decades after Mansa Musa's reign and left the most detailed surviving eyewitness account of the empire, described a society of considerable order and sophistication, with a legal system that he respected, markets that functioned with efficiency and honesty, and a degree of personal security in travel that he contrasted favorably with what he had experienced elsewhere in his extensive journeys. He was critical of some aspects of Mali court culture that conflicted with his North African Muslim sensibilities, but his overall portrait was of a functioning and sophisticated civilization that should not be dismissed as peripheral to the major currents of medieval world history. It was into this world that Musa Keita was born, probably around 1280 to 1290, though the exact date is uncertain. He was the grandson of Abu Bakr, a brother of Sundiata Keita, meaning that he came from the royal Keita line but was not in the direct line of succession. He became Mansa through a path that was contingent and somewhat unexpected. His predecessor on the throne, Mansa Abu Bakr II, was a ruler of unusually adventurous spirit who had become obsessed with the question of what lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean, a question that preoccupied some of the most intellectually curious minds of the medieval period in ways that anticipate the European age of exploration by more than a century. Abu Bakr II assembled an enormous fleet of 2,000 vessels, according to the account that Mansa Musa later gave to the Sultan of Egypt, and sailed west into the Atlantic with most of the fleet and most of the crew. Only one ship returned. Abu Bakr II was never seen again. He had effectively disappeared into the Atlantic Ocean sometime around 1311, and Musa Keita became the ruler of the Mali Empire in his absence, assuming the title of Mansa, meaning King of Kings or Emperor, and beginning a reign that would last until approximately 1337. Mansa Musa inherited a vast and wealthy empire, but he was not content to simply administer what he had received. He was an empire builder in the most active sense, expanding Mali's territory significantly during his reign, bringing the important trading cities of Timbuktu and Gao under his direct control in campaigns that extended the empire's reach into the crucial commercial crossroads of the Niger Bend region. Timbuktu was already by this period one of the most significant cities in the Islamic world, a center of trans-Saharan commerce where the gold of the south met the salt of the north, and where merchants from Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, and beyond came to trade. Its capture by Mansa Musa was not merely a military achievement but a statement of imperial ambition that announced to the Islamic world that the ruler of Mali was a player of the first rank. He was also a devout Muslim, and this was not merely a political convenience but a genuine personal commitment that shaped both his domestic policies and his international identity. Islam had been spreading through West Africa along the trade routes since at least the 11th century, and the rulers of the Mali Empire had adopted Islam while also maintaining the traditional religious practices of the Mandinka people, creating a syncretic religious culture in which Islamic faith coexisted with indigenous animist traditions rather than displacing them entirely. Mansa Musa was more orthodox in his Islam than many of his predecessors, genuinely committed to the scholarly and devotional dimensions of the faith rather than treating it purely as a diplomatic asset, and this commitment expressed itself most dramatically in his decision to undertake the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. The preparation for the Hajj took years. The logistics of moving a pilgrimage caravan of the scale Mansa Musa planned across the Sahara Desert, through Egypt, and into the Hijaz region of the Arabian Peninsula where Mecca was located required planning and resource mobilization of a complexity that would challenge any modern government, let alone a medieval empire operating without electronic communication or motorized transport. The gold that would be needed to sustain the caravan, to give as gifts along the way, to demonstrate to the Islamic world the wealth and status of the ruler who was coming, had to be gathered from the gold fields and prepared for transport. The provisions for tens of thousands of people crossing one of the most inhospitable environments on earth had to be assembled. The political arrangements needed to ensure the security of the empire during the Mansa's extended absence had to be made. And the selection of the scholars, poets, advisors, and religious figures who would accompany the pilgrimage and represent the cultural achievements of the Mali Empire to the wider Islamic world had to be carried out with care. The caravan that set out from Mali in 1324 was, by any historical measure, the most spectacular human procession that the medieval world had ever seen. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources give varying figures for its size, and the numbers have clearly been inflated in some accounts by the natural tendency of witnesses to magnify what was already extraordinary. But even the most conservative credible estimates describe something that was without precedent. The caravan included 60,000 soldiers and administrators, 12,000 personal servants for the Mansa himself, each dressed in elaborate brocade and silk clothing and carrying a golden staff, 500 servants who walked before the Mansa as his personal honor guard also carrying golden staffs, and a train of 80 to 100 camels each carrying between 200 and 300 pounds of gold dust. The total weight of gold in the caravan has been estimated by modern historians at somewhere between 10 and 18 tons, a figure that represented an enormous proportion of the world's entire monetary supply of gold at that time. The caravan moved northward through the Western Sahara, following the established trade routes through the desert oases, and entered Egypt through the western approaches, arriving at Cairo in July 1324. The encounter between the caravan and Egypt was the moment that introduced Mansa Musa to the wider Islamic world in a way that would ensure his fame for centuries. The Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Al-Nasir Muhammad ibn Qalawun, was himself a significant ruler of one of the most powerful states in the medieval Islamic world, and the protocol of his court required that visitors demonstrate their submission to his authority in specific ceremonial ways. Mansa Musa, as the sovereign ruler of an empire at least as large and arguably as wealthy as Egypt's, was not prepared to prostrate himself before the Egyptian sultan, and the diplomatic negotiations over this question of protocol created tensions in the initial meeting between the two rulers that required considerable delicacy to resolve. What happened next in Cairo would have consequences that lasted more than a decade. Mansa Musa was in Cairo for approximately 3 months, and during this time he distributed gold with a generosity that can most charitably be described as spectacular and most accurately described as catastrophically economically disruptive. He gave gold to beggars in the streets. He gave gold to officials who attended him. He gave gold as gifts to every dignitary, scholar, and religious figure who came to pay their respects. He gave gold to mosques and religious establishments. He spent gold in the markets on goods that took his fancy, always at prices that he insisted on paying at whatever level the merchant asked rather than negotiating, because negotiating over prices would have implied that his resources were limited. He gave so much gold away so freely that the price of gold in Egypt collapsed. The sudden flood of gold into the Egyptian economy, which was already a gold-using economy with established prices and exchange rates, created a wave of inflation as gold became suddenly far more plentiful relative to goods and services than it had been before the caravan arrived. Prices in the markets of Cairo, Medina, and Mecca rose sharply as merchants adjusted to the new reality that the buyer in front of them was willing to pay whatever was asked. The historical sources suggest that prices across the Egyptian and broader Middle Eastern economy took as long as 12 to 14 years to fully recover to their pre-Musa levels, a macroeconomic disruption of extraordinary magnitude caused by the generosity of a single traveler. Modern economists who have studied this episode describe it as one of the most remarkable examples of unintended economic consequences in historical record. A case where the scale of a single actor's resources was large enough to move an entire regional economy in ways that the actor himself clearly had not anticipated and probably did not fully understand. Mansa Musa reportedly recognized the damage he had caused and attempted to ameliorate it by borrowing gold back from Egyptian merchants at high interest rates, reducing the supply somewhat, though whether this actually had significant effect on the inflation he had created is unclear from the historical record. From Egypt, the caravan continued east to the Hijaz and to Mecca itself, where Mansa Musa performed the Hajj rituals with the same combination of deep personal devotion and spectacular material display that had characterized the entire journey. He made substantial donations to the mosques and religious establishments of Mecca and Medina, funded the construction or renovation of religious buildings, and presented himself to the scholars and religious authorities of the holy cities as a ruler whose commitment to Islam was both genuine and generously expressed. He was received with the honor that his status and his generosity warranted, and the connections he formed during the Hajj with scholars and architects from across the Islamic world would prove enormously consequential for the cultural development of his empire when he returned. Among the figures he encountered during his pilgrimage was a man named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, an Andalusian poet and architect from Granada who was living in Cairo at the time of the caravan's passage through Egypt. Al-Sahili was a man of considerable cultural sophistication who had been educated in the traditions of Andalusian Islamic architecture and who caught Mansa Musa's attention through his learning and his conversation. The Mansa invited him to return to Mali with the caravan, and al-Sahili accepted, beginning an association that would transform the architectural landscape of the Mali Empire and that has left physical traces which survive in some form to the present day. The mosque at Jen, the Great Mosque at Timbuktu, and several other architectural monuments of the Western Saharan and Sahel regions were built or significantly influenced by the architectural traditions that al-Sahili brought from Andalusian and North African Islamic civilization to West Africa, creating the distinctive style of Sudano-Sahelian architecture with its mud brick construction, its tapering minarets, and its wooden projecting beams called torans that are also used as permanent scaffolding for the regular maintenance that the mud brick construction requires. When the pilgrimage caravan finally returned to Mali, it brought back not only the spiritual merit of the Hajj but an extraordinary collection of scholars, architects, books, and artistic influences that represented a deliberate effort by Mansa Musa to elevate the intellectual and cultural life of his empire to a level that would command the respect of the wider Islamic world. He had left as a powerful but relatively obscure ruler. He returned as one of the most famous monarchs on earth, his name now known from Morocco to Egypt to Arabia, his wealth a subject of wonder and speculation across the Islamic world and beyond it, his empire suddenly visible on the maps and in the consciousness of the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations that had previously known next to nothing about what lay south of the Sahara. The reign that followed the Hajj was one of deliberate cultural construction. Mansa Musa invested the wealth that his empire continued to generate from the gold trade in the building of mosques, schools, libraries, and the infrastructure of Islamic learning. He made Timbuktu, which he had already brought under his control militarily, into a genuine center of Islamic scholarship of international standing. The Sankor Mosque and its associated madrasa, the Islamic university that developed around it, became one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world, attracting scholars from across the Islamic world to study and teach in a city that sat on the edge of the Sahara but that commanded resources that few other institutions in the world could match. At its height, the University of Sankor is estimated to have enrolled as many as 25,000 students, studying theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, history, and literature. The libraries of Timbuktu accumulated manuscripts by the hundreds of thousands, texts in Arabic covering every field of medieval Islamic learning, collected and copied and preserved in a city that the outside world thought of, when it thought of it at all, as a remote desert outpost, but that was in reality one of the most important intellectual centers of the 14th and 15th century world. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are themselves one of the most significant and most poorly understood aspects of West African history, because their existence contradicts so completely the colonial-era narrative of Africa as a continent without written history or intellectual tradition that many people in the modern world are simply not aware of them. Some estimates suggest that between 300,000 and 700,000 manuscripts survive in Timbuktu and the surrounding region, written in Arabic and in African languages using the Arabic script, covering subjects from Quranic exegesis and Islamic law to mathematics and astronomy to local history and genealogy to medicine and agriculture. They are the physical evidence of a civilization of extraordinary intellectual richness, and their survival, though incomplete given the damage done by the Moroccan invasion of 1591 and the subsequent political instability of the region, is a testament to the cultural vision that Mansa Musa brought to the city he transformed. The economy over which Mansa Musa presided was one of the most remarkable in the medieval world. The gold trade that was the empire's primary source of wealth operated through a system that the Arab geographers described with fascination and some puzzlement. A system of silent trade at the gold fields in which the identity of the miners was kept deliberately secret from the merchants who came to buy their gold. Merchants from the north would arrive at a designated trading place, leave their goods, beat drums, and then withdraw. The miners would then appear, examine the goods, leave the quantity of gold they considered to be a fair exchange, and withdraw. The merchants would return, and if they found the gold satisfactory, they would take it and leave the goods. If not, they would leave both and withdraw again, and the process would continue through another cycle of negotiation by gesture and absence until an agreement was reached. This system, which sounds almost mythological in the accounts that describe it, was apparently a functional mechanism for protecting the secrecy of the gold mines and ensuring that the miners could not be traced, located, or coerced into revealing the sources of the empire's primary wealth. The salt trade that balanced the gold trade was equally central to the empire's prosperity. Salt from the Saharan mines, particularly from Tagaza, where the houses, the mosques, and even the palace were built of blocks of salt because wood and stone were so scarce, was so valuable in the sub-Saharan regions that it was traded weight for weight against gold at certain times and places. The control of the routes along which salt moved southward and gold moved northward was one of the fundamental strategic priorities of the Mali Empire, and Mansa Musa's expansion of the empire's territory was partly driven by the desire to control more of these crucial commercial arteries. Beyond the gold and salt that formed the empire's commercial foundation, the Mali Empire was also a major producer and exporter of other goods that found markets across the Islamic world and beyond. Kola nuts, which were valued across the Sahel and into the forest regions as a stimulant that also served social and ceremonial functions, moved northward through the empire's commercial networks. Copper from the mines at Takeda in what is now northeastern Niger was another significant export. Ivory, animal skins, ostrich feathers, and enslaved people, a practice that was embedded in the commercial systems of the medieval world across cultures and continents, and whose moral dimensions are inseparable from any honest account of the period, were also significant components of the trans-Saharan trade in both directions. The international reputation that Mansa Musa acquired through his Hajj expressed itself concretely in the cartography of the medieval world. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most sophisticated and beautiful maps produced in medieval Europe, includes a depiction of Mansa Musa on his throne in the center of West Africa, holding a gold nugget in one hand and a golden scepter in the other, surrounded by an inscription describing him as the richest and most noble king in all the land, owing to the abundance of gold that is extracted in his country. The image is striking not only for what it shows but for what it represents, which is the integration of the Mali Empire into the European geographical consciousness at a time when most Europeans still thought of Africa as a largely unknown continent lying beyond the limits of the civilized world. That consciousness was created, in very large part, by the spectacle of Mansa Musa's Hajj caravan and the stories it generated as it passed through the cities of the Islamic world. The later years of his reign were marked by the consolidation of the achievements of the earlier decades rather than by major new initiatives. He continued to patronize Islamic scholarship and to develop the urban centers of his empire. He maintained the commercial infrastructure that was the source of his empire's wealth. He dealt with the security challenges that confronted any ruler of a territory as large as Mali's, including the management of vassal states whose loyalty was always contingent on the empire's ability to enforce its authority, and the persistent threat of raiding from the Tuareg nomads of the Sahara who preyed on the trade routes and the settled communities of the Sahel when they perceived weakness. His death, which occurred around 1337, though the date is uncertain, marked the beginning of a period of decline for the Mali Empire that would accelerate through the rest of the 14th century and into the 15th. His successors proved unable to maintain the combination of military effectiveness, political skill, and commercial vision that had made the empire under Mansa Musa one of the great powers of the medieval world. The Songhai people of the Niger Bend began asserting their independence, and the city of Timbuktu, which Mansa Musa had made the crown jewel of the empire, changed hands multiple times between Mali and Songhai forces in the conflicts of the late 14th and early 15th centuries. By the time the Songhai Empire under Sunni Ali and his successor Askia the Great emerged as the dominant power of the Western Sahel in the late 15th century, the Mali Empire had been reduced to a fraction of its former extent, retaining the core territories of the Mandinka homeland but having lost the great commercial cities that had been the source of its wealth and its international standing. The Moroccan invasion of 1591, in which a Moroccan army crossed the Sahara with firearms, defeated the Songhai forces at the Battle of Tondabai and sacked Timbuktu, was the event that effectively destroyed the intellectual and commercial infrastructure that Mansa Musa had built and that had been maintained and extended by the Songhai under Askia the Great. The libraries were damaged. The scholars were killed or driven into exile. The sophisticated commercial networks were disrupted. The city that had been one of the great intellectual centers of the world began its long decline into the relative obscurity that it would occupy in the European imagination for the centuries that followed, known dimly as a remote and fabled destination rather than as the genuine center of civilization it had been. It is worth pausing here to consider the full weight of what was lost, because the story of Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire is not merely interesting as an example of medieval history. It is important as a corrective to one of the most damaging and most persistent misrepresentations in the history of the modern world. The European slave trade that began in the 15th century and the colonialism that followed it in the 19th century required, for their justification, a narrative in which the peoples of Africa were without history, without civilization, without the intellectual and organizational achievements that might have demanded a different moral accounting from those who were enslaving and colonizing them. That narrative was false when it was constructed, and the evidence for its falsity was there for anyone who chose to look at it honestly, in the manuscripts of Timbuktu, in the accounts of Ibn Battuta and al-Bakri and the other Arab travelers who had described the Mali Empire and its predecessors, in the Catalan Atlas and the other European maps that had acknowledged the wealth and sophistication of West African civilization. The falsity of the colonial narrative did not prevent it from becoming enormously influential, and the influence it has had on the way Africa and Africans have been perceived by the rest of the world for the past 500 years has caused harm so vast and so enduring that its full accounting is still being undertaken. Mansa Musa himself, in the centuries following his death, became a semi-legendary figure whose fame in the Islamic world was genuinely extraordinary but whose story was largely unknown in Europe and the Americas until relatively recent times. The Arab chroniclers who wrote about him in the decades and centuries following his reign described him in the most superlative terms available, as the most generous king who had ever lived, as the ruler who had brought the light of Islamic learning to the far west of the known world, as a man whose wealth was so great that he had given away enough gold in a single journey to destabilize the economies of entire civilizations. The griots of West Africa preserved his memory in oral traditions that are still recited today, maintaining the stories of Sundiata and Mansa Musa as foundational narratives of Mandinka identity and West African civilization. The question of how wealthy Mansa Musa actually was is one that modern economists and historians have attempted to answer with varying methodologies and considerable disagreement about the appropriate approach. The straightforward comparison of his estimated wealth in gold to the current price of gold yields figures in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The more sophisticated approach of calculating the proportion of the world's total gold supply that he controlled, or of considering the purchasing power of his resources relative to the economies of his time, yields even larger figures. Celebrity net worth and various financial media have published estimates suggesting that his inflation-adjusted wealth exceeded $400 billion, making him far wealthier than any individual in the contemporary world. Other economists have argued that these comparisons are methodologically flawed because the concept of individual net worth is not meaningfully applicable to medieval monarchs who controlled state resources rather than personal ones in the modern sense. What is beyond serious dispute is that the resources Mansa Musa commanded were so far beyond those of any contemporary ruler, and so large relative to the global gold supply of his era, that they were genuinely without historical precedent. The legacy of Mansa Musa extends beyond the economic and political into the cultural and the intellectual. The architectural traditions he introduced to the Mali Empire through the influence of al-Sahili have persisted in the Sahel and Savannah regions of West Africa in forms that are still visible today. The great mudbrick mosques of Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger representing a continuous tradition that traces its origins to the building program that Mansa Musa's patronage made possible. The intellectual tradition of Timbuktu, though damaged by the Moroccan invasion and the subsequent centuries of political instability, has not been entirely extinguished. The manuscripts that survived in private collections and family libraries across the Timbuktu region are being digitized and studied by scholars from around the world, and their contents continue to reveal the depth and sophistication of the intellectual life of the city that Mansa Musa made into one of the great centers of medieval learning. His story has also become, in the 21st century, an important element of the ongoing effort to reclaim and reconstruct a more accurate and more complete history of Africa, one that acknowledges the achievements of pre-colonial African civilizations rather than treating the continent's history as beginning with the arrival of Europeans. The figure of Mansa Musa, the emperor so wealthy that his pilgrimage destabilized the economies of the medieval Islamic world, who built universities and libraries in the Sahara, who sent his predecessor to discover the Americas 2 centuries before Columbus, who was depicted in the most sophisticated European map of his era as the richest and most noble king in all the land, is a figure who makes it impossible to sustain the colonial narrative of Africa as a continent without history, civilization, or achievement. There is one final element of the Mansa Musa story that deserves more attention than it usually receives, and that is the account of his predecessor Abu Bakr II's Atlantic voyage. The story that Mansa Musa told to the Sultan of Egypt, about the 2,000 ships that sailed west and never returned, about the single ship that came back with a survivor's account of a great river in the middle of the ocean that pulled everything toward it, has generated considerable scholarly debate. Some historians have dismissed it as a mythological elaboration. Others have taken it seriously as evidence that West African sailors may have reached the Americas before Columbus's voyages of 1492, pointing to linguistic, botanical, and other circumstantial evidence that trade contacts between West Africa and pre-Columbian America may have occurred. The question is almost certainly unanswerable with the evidence currently available, but it opens a window onto the breadth of imagination and ambition that characterized the leadership of the Mali Empire at its height. Rulers who were not content with the known world but who sent fleets into the unknown ocean in pursuit of what lay beyond the horizon. Mansa Musa died around 1337, 57 years old by most estimates, having reigned for approximately 25 years over the most powerful state in West Africa and one of the great empires of the medieval world. He left behind a transformed landscape physically, in the mosques and buildings that al-Sahili and other architects had constructed, intellectually, in the universities and libraries of Timbuktu and the other cities of his empire, commercially, in the expanded network of trade routes and market towns that his campaigns had brought under imperial control, and internationally, in the reputation that his Hajj had created for the Mali Empire across the breadth of the Islamic world. He did not leave behind a stable succession, and the empire he had built began to fragment within decades of his death, as the structural tensions between the imperial center and the vassal states reasserted themselves without his authority to hold them in balance. But the story of Mansa Musa is not ultimately a story about institutional durability or the longevity of empires. It is a story about what human civilization is capable of producing in places and in periods that the dominant historical narratives of the modern world have chosen to ignore, and about the cost to our collective understanding of ourselves and our world that such ignorance imposes. The richest human being who ever lived was an African emperor who spent his wealth on mosques and universities and libraries, who brought scholars and architects from across the Islamic world to the edge of the Sahara and built a center of learning there that drew students from Morocco to Egypt, who walked through the cities of medieval Egypt and the holy cities of Arabia and left in his wake an inflation that took 12 years to subside and a reputation that cartographers were still recording, 50 years after his death. His name was Mansa Musa, and if you did not know his story before today, you now know why that matters. What do you think about Mansa Musa and the civilization he represented? Did this story change how you think about African history? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Your support for this channel means everything, and we look forward to bringing you many more stories from the history that the textbooks left out. Thank you so much for watching.